Alright, here we go. But the same momentum works on the downside. Europeans may follow Caldwell's scenario and decide 25 years from now that they should have more babies. But where will the requisite numbers of parents come from? Surely not from the hollowed-out shells of Dutch, Italian, German, and Hungarian, and Greek cohorts born before the birth dearth, unless they decide to have, say, 4 or 5 children per woman, which certainly doesn't seem too likely. The second solution is simpler: immigration. The modern countries are generally rich, certainly compared with the poor countries of the world. Wouldn't poor people want to get to rich places? Modern countries in low fertility spiral will need workers. The headline news is a sort of that says, the headline news is of the sort that says Germany will give visas to Indian computer experts. That's fine, but much of that kind of work can often be produced off-site in Hyderabad, the Bangalore, and delivered by pressing the send button. Such is not the case with other types of service workers, particularly at the lower end of the occupation spectrum. After all, who will take care of the burgeoning numbers of old people around the world? Who will empty the bedpans in the nursing homes? Who will wash the dishes? Nannies can be an exception, sometimes marrying a millionaire. Most are poor immigrants. Who will mow the lawns? Who will make up the rooms in hotels? It is not likely to be Germans born of German one-child families and raised as, quote, little Kaisers. Jeez, that sounds kind of racist. Okay. In China, they call the only child the, quote, little emperor. If such menial tasks are to be done, they will likely be done by immigrants or their descendants. In the German case, typically Turks. This is by no means a new pattern. Immigration starts out at the worst jobs. Unfortunately, you've seen what the quotar thing and setting up like competitions around the world, just using immigration for that, as you've seen. Well, that has nothing to do with this, but in general. Okay. Their children and grandchildren do better, but will these nations with 10% of unemployment rates become more immigrants with open arms? Everything we know about the politics of Europe and Japan says no. A recent UN publication, Replacement Migration 2001, gave some estimates of needed immigration under certain scenarios. It caused a firestorm in Europe to the point where the European Union issued a statement telling the UN Population Division to mind its own business. Consider Europe according to, quote, replacement migration. So, I'm wondering if this, like, replacement language in the birth dearth is, like, where conservatives are getting the idea of the Great Replacement. Because I feel like it has nothing to do with what conservatives are saying. It's just you need parents to replace the parents that might die, and so you have kids for that. So it could just be this big extrapolation that they're making. Alright. Consider Europe with replacement. Today, Europe has more than twice as many people as the United States, but the whole continent takes in a net of 376,000 immigrants per year, about a third of the American number. In order to keep a total constant population, the Europe immigration number would have to rise to 1,009,000 per year, an annual increase of more than 500%. To maintain a constant age group of workers aged 15 to 64, the number of immigrants would have to rise to 3,227,000 per year, an annual increase of more than 900%. The UNPD has calculated that it would take to keep the dependency ratio constant, that is, the proportion of working age persons to those over 65 and under 15, that would require an annual immigration of 27,139,000, in an increase more than 7,100%. That is not likely to happen. These were big, tough numbers when they were published in March 2000. The majority of immigrants who come to Europe are Muslims, mostly Arabs. Even after decades of residence, most have not integrated into their host societies or been allowed to. The immigrant assimilation ethic is not there. The Dutchman is born Dutch, talks Dutch, eats Dutch, and has Dutch ancestors. That is the pattern, though there are few exceptions. Among the lower classes in Germany, there is a substantial intermarriage between Germans and the offspring of Turkish immigrants. Some Pakistanis come to England as an entitlement of their membership in the British Commonwealth and have experienced some social integration. A black immigrant from a former Commonwealth country may be regarded as British. Oh god, it's quoting British. Jeez. But there are exceptions. Many of the immigrants in Europe do not vote. In many nations, they and other offspring typically have great difficulty achieving citizenship. In Italy, it takes about 15 years for legal immigrants to become full-fledged citizens, unless they have an Italian ancestor. Most Europeans believe that the presence of Muslim immigration has increased crime. Wow, Jesus Christ. And he goes on to say, which is probably correct. Jeez. As a recent French official report, never released, showed, the rise in anti-Semitism in Europe is in large measure fueled by Muslim immigrant populations. Although Europeans needed no lessons in anti-Semitism. That's a good point. Alright. I mean, that's so true. So it's not even like a religious issue from the other side. We're just doing it over here too, so hardly matters, aside from the crime aspect. But when you're treated like shit and you're treated like some caste that just came here, like, of course, like, you're gonna be a little angry, and you're not allowed to assimilate, which is bullshit, because Arab people have fought in World War I believe, and so, like, they have earned the right to be Americans. I mean, at least from the perspective of going to war and protecting our country, you know? Okay. At least I'm pretty sure I heard that Arabs were in World War I. I'm not gonna be that skeptical about that. And all that was the situation before 9/11. Since then, a European-wide dragnet has been draped over Muslim residents who come from countries that have not been involved in terror. Some European countries have called for the expulsion of Muslim immigrants or have made it much harder for Muslim illegals to enter the European zone, or have cut back on the admittance of refugees. So neither elementary solution to the declining birth rate will be easy. Even the solid rise in fertility that Jack Caldwell speculates about would take many decades to reverse the coming depopulation, and immigration is resisted and resented. That's very true. I do like how he's very honest about our attitudes and that we don't really do what we need to do to actually fix this problem. We're just worried about, like, what Tucker Carlson would say, legacy types, you know, that bullshit. Okay. Hold on, where am I? So, in early 2004, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan issued a vigorous statement supporting more immigration to Europe and more humane treatment for its immigrants. But the Secretary General lacks standing in this situation. He is elected by countries, not by voters. This is not a simple situation for the Europeans, nor for the Japanese. They find themselves in a demographic ditch of monumental proportions. A commercial question will be explored in a later chapter, But I ask here as an appetizer. It is attractive to invest in a company that does domestic business while the members of domestic customers grow fewer and fewer. The weirdness of the current situation may be seen somewhat simplistically in this way. For more of the first half of the 20th century, the peoples of Europe and Japan slaughtered each other or their neighbors partly in order to pass along their seed ideologically and demographically. Then, during the second half of the century and now into the 21st, a new attitude has emerged. Quote, "To hell with all that. They now hardly bother to have babies. This is not necessarily bad news. We shall speculate about that. But if someone understands it, please explain." Okay, chapter 3. I don't even know if I read chapter 2 out loud. I mean, I'll probably have to put it in the description soon. Sorry, guys, if you're confused. Alright, chapter 3. Less developed, less fertility. We have become accustomed to think of the less developed countries, LCDs, allies, the third world, as the place where the population explosion goes bang. Images race across our minds. Many small children trailing a weary mother, living in rotten slums and favels in sprawling, overgrowing, and unmanageable cities, drinking unsanitary water under horrible health conditions with a standard of living hardly worth the phrase. Or there is a rural model, even more children, even greater poverty, illiterate and broken men and women hopelessly trying to scratch a living out of tired land, often victims of disease long since vanished from the modern world. Often civil war rages. There is enough truth to such a description to make grown men cry. There are also more hopeful aspects to the situation, particularly on the demographic side. Yet they seem to be rarely discussed. As recently as 1965 to 1970, the TFR of the LCDs was 6 children per woman. By 1985 to 1990, the rate had fallen to 3.8, a very substantial drop, but a very high level. In the 2000-2005 time frame, the TFR in the LCDs is 2.9 children per woman, and actually somewhat lower because we are near the end of that period. Such a demographic movement is most rapid fertility freefall ever. The cause? All the traditional ones: urbanization, education, women in the workforce, contraception, abortion, and the intensification of somewhat new one. The birth dearth has gained steam among poor and uneducated women, breaking some old rules. We shall explain later. Which countries qualify as less developed? All those that were not originally categorized as more developed, that is, the poor countries, but since that classification system took effect in the 1960s, some of the poor countries have become not poor countries. Perhaps the most sustainable is South Korea. In 1960s, the per capita income in South Korea was $1,325 per year, in constant 1995 US dollars. In 2000, it was $13,199, moving toward European levels. Like the European nation, South Korea is a democracy. The UN's 2002 volume carried its TFR at 1.4 children per woman, a European level, but it is still counted as an LCD because it once was. Taiwan has a similar history, though it does not receive a separate page in the UN data volume, because China says Taiwan is a part of China. These days, more of the 22 million residents of Taiwan apparently don't agree. Yes, self-determination should be agreed upon. But that's not much arguing with China, the world's largest country, with its 1.3 billion people and growing fleet of nuclear missiles. Still, the LCD is not a bad classification. In broad strokes, it is composed of all of Latin America, Africa, and Asia, with the Pacific exceptions of Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. These regions do indeed make up the poorer part of humanity, though there are substantial disparities among them. The two most populous nations in the world, China and India, are LCDs in the year 2000. China had 1.28 billion people in India, 1.2 billion. Oh, wait, what? China had 1.28 billion people, and India had 1.0 billion. Okay, they are the only two nations in the billionaire clubs. No one else is even close. The United States was in third place with a mere 285 million people, about one-fourth of China and one-third of that of India. One of every three people in the world today is either Chinese or Indian. Each of the demographic billionaires have interesting demographic tales to tell. In the late 1960s, China had a total fertility rate of 6.06 children per woman in its peak year. That was almost exactly the average rate in the time for all the less developed countries, 6.0. 30 years later, the Chinese rate had fallen to 1.8, well below replacement. What happened? In 1978, the Chinese government, then still led by Chairman Mao, instituted a, quote, one-child policy, national family planning, with a coercive enforcement mechanism. Officially, no Chinese couple was permitted by the government to bear more than one child. Enforcement required a top-down bureaucracy of massive proportions. In cities where the rules were more stringently applied, block captains kept close tabs on every female in their designated area. How many children did the woman have? Was she pregnant? Had she missed her menstrual period? Because the communist government had near total control of the country. Effective pressure could be brought to bear to bring family, could be the reason for fertility rates down rapidly. Could be brought to bear to bring fertility. Okay, yeah, obviously. What kind of pressure? Lots of women's jobs in the country where the government at that time was just about the only employer. Less of her husband's jobs. Oh, loss of her husband's jobs. Loss of the residence permit in the country where the government owned just about all the housing. Sometimes there were forced sterilizations after the birth of the first child. If all else failed, a woman pregnant with the second child could be forced to abort the fetus. The coercive Chinese program worked, but not totally. The stated recent Chinese TFR is 1.8, far higher than the one-child family rule. Many human rights activists and some population activists regarded this policy as thoroughly evil, placing the state in total control of an intensely important and personal matter. That's my view. Some of the population activists thought that playing the China card in that way was an appropriate, if difficult, policy. China already had the population of 729 million people in 1965, with a growth rate of 2.6% a year. Very high. A rate that would double the population in 27 years. They accepted the Chinese government's view that the country would never realize economic growth unless population growth could be brought under control, quickly and forcibly. Ultimately, the matter became politicized. The United States refused to let any of its contributions to the UN Fund for Populations activities go to aid population control that included forced abortions. The UNFPA said that the US money wasn't going for that purpose, that funds were only helping China use other methods of family planning, and that coercion or forced abortion wasn't that common anyways. So this is my opinion, and you've heard people say forced sex. Okay, that's rape. So a forced abortion is literally just eugenics. That's, I know the wording and is a little odd. I guess there's some overlap, unfortunately. All right. One root of the debate concerned this question: did population growth curtail economic growth? Another question emerged among geopolitically minded: if population ultimately plays an important role in creating power and influence, wasn't America better off if China, a potential adversary, had fewer people in the long run, no matter how repugnant their population policies today? Um, A commission has been appointed by the Chinese government to study the policy. Demographer Daniel Goodkind of the International Program Center of the U.S. Census Bureau estimates that the Chinese total fertility rate is 1.65, below the UN's listed of TFR of 1.83. Goodkind's data is based on official information from the Chinese National Bureau of Statistics, which probably means the UN 2004 data mid-century projections will come down. Thus, the UN's TFR's uh, estimate is higher than that suggested by recent official data. According to the Population Reference Bureau, the rules have been implemented irregularly. Urban couples are typically limited to one child, but rural couples are allowed two children if the first is a daughter. What would happen if restrictions were lifted? If the TFR went up to, say, 2.0 children per woman, it would mean about 1.4 million additional births per year, and something like an additional 70 million people by 2050. What happened in China after the one-child policy was put into effect? In successive 5-year time blocks, the TFR in successive 5-year time blocks, the TFR fell from 6.06 children per woman in 1960 to 1965 to 4.86 5 years later to 3.32 to 2.0 to 2.55 and to 2.46 to below replacement at